Sometimes a single bad model kit can kill interest in a hobby that hasn't even properly started yet. With the huge number of kits available today, even experienced modelers can struggle to choose, let alone beginners who often pick their first kit based only on attractive box art. And there's always a risk that behind a beautiful box hides a kit meant for experienced builders, not for someone just starting out. So today we'll talk about exactly those cases, and about the kits beginners should avoid to keep from getting disappointed in the hobby. Older kits from Revell, Airfix, and Italeri may look simple and affordable, but beginners should approach them with caution. And the older the tooling, the more careful you need to be before buying. These kits often suffer from poor fit and geometry issues. As a result, the build turns into constant sanding, filling, and correcting parts, work that usually requires experience and patience that beginners simply don't have yet. Another issue is that Revell often re-releases very old kits with new box art, so it's not always obvious that the model inside might actually come from tooling developed back in the 1980s. That's why it's worth checking what you're buying before committing to a kit. Some people say these kits help beginners develop skills, but at the start, this often becomes wasted effort. A beginner first needs to learn how to build a model cleanly, straight out of the box, not spend all their time fighting plastic, filler, and sandpaper. Another common problem for beginners is jet aircraft with complex air intakes. In these kits, you often have to assemble long internal intake ducts that are difficult to sand properly and even harder to paint cleanly. Such kits are not completely unsuitable for beginners, but you should be prepared that the final result may fall below expectations. And that disappointment is sometimes enough to make people lose interest in the hobby right at the start. These difficulties can appear even in popular beginner-friendly kits from manufacturers like Tamiya and Academy, where visible joints inside the intake can still affect the final appearance. Beginners often simply don't understand how to deal with this issue. That's why, at the beginning, it's usually better to choose aircraft with simpler intake designs, including some kits from Tamiya, or even start with propeller-driven aircraft, where these problems simply don't exist. Kits that beginners should definitely avoid are those from Zoukei-Mura. This company is known for producing extremely detailed kits that feel more like miniature engineering projects than regular model kits. Inside the box, you'll often find a huge number of small parts, complex assemblies, detailed internal structures, and separate engine sections that require careful planning and precise assembly. Even experienced modelers often treat these kits as long and demanding projects. For beginners, however, these kits often become a source of frustration. Instead of enjoying the build, the process turns into a constant struggle with tiny parts and complicated construction. That's why Zoukei-Mura kits are better saved for later, when you already have more experience and confidence working with complex models. Another manufacturer that beginners should approach with caution is Kittyhawk. Their kits often look very attractive thanks to high levels of detail and interesting aircraft choices, but they also tend to be quite demanding to build. Kittyhawk kits usually include a large number of small parts and complex assemblies that require constant test fitting and careful alignment. Many of their subjects are already complicated aircraft, modern jets with complex shapes and numerous small details. And the engineering of the kits can make the build even more challenging. At the same time, modelers sometimes criticize the instructions and part fit for being confusing or inconsistent. As a result, instead of enjoying the build, beginners often find themselves constantly struggling with alignment issues and unclear assembly steps. And a first model should feel rewarding, not like a continuous fight with the kit. Although Trumpeter is one of my favorite brands when it comes to armored vehicle kits, usually offering a good balance between complexity and detail, things are a bit different when it comes to their aircraft models. The company produces a huge range of aircraft kits in different scales, and to be fair, not all of them are difficult. Some can work fine even for beginners, depending on the specific kit. But there is a category of models that newcomers are better off avoiding. These are mainly large, modern jet aircraft in 1/32nd scale, such as the F.XVIII Crusader, F.35A Lightning II, F.18 Hornet, or MiG-29. These kits usually include a very large number of parts, complex intake structures, detailed internal sections, and many assemblies that require precise fitting. As a result, the build turns into a long and demanding project that can take even experienced modelers weeks to complete. So if this is your first or one of your first models, it's usually better to start with something simpler and leave these big, complex projects for later, once you feel more confident in your skills. It's also difficult to recommend most transport and passenger aircraft kits to beginners. Of course, much depends on the modeler's own expectations and patience, but the main challenge with these kits is their size and the amount of work required to achieve a good result. Large surfaces usually need a lot of filling and sanding, as well as a significant amount of paint. Painting itself is also demanding, especially with civilian airliners, which need a smooth, flawless, glossy finish. Any imperfections on such large, single-color surfaces become immediately noticeable. So in the end, choosing these kits is really up to the modeler. If you're ready to spend extra time and effort on a large project, they can be enjoyable. But for a first build, it's usually better to start with something simpler. Another category that often turns out to be challenging for beginners is World War I biplanes. These aircraft look impressive and are historically fascinating, but in scale modeling they are considered some of the trickiest subjects to build. The main difficulty comes from the biplane structure itself, with two wings connected by multiple struts and rigging wires. Both wings need to be perfectly aligned, the struts must sit correctly, and then the rigging has to be added between the wings. Even a small alignment mistake can leave the whole aircraft looking crooked, and fixing it afterward is often very difficult. On top of that, many of these models are quite delicate, and it's easy to break or misalign parts while handling the model during assembly. Examples that can be particularly tough for beginners include highly detailed kits from Wingnut Wings in 1/32nd scale, as well as some biplane kits from Roden and Special Hobby, where fit and alignment often demand experience and patience. So while World War I aircraft are very attractive subjects, they're usually better tackled after gaining some experience. Otherwise, the build can easily turn into a constant struggle to keep everything straight instead of an enjoyable project. And finally, a few words about the already mentioned brand, Roden. Besides World War I aircraft, they also produce many other interesting subjects, including rare prototypes and transport aircraft, often at quite attractive prices, which is exactly what makes them tempting for beginners. However, there is an important catch. The situation here is somewhat similar to older Revell or Italeri kits, and sometimes even more challenging. Roden has long been known for inconsistent molding quality, and among modelers there are plenty of stories about the amount of filling and adjustment sometimes required just to bring a model to a decent standard. Many parts need careful test fitting and correction, otherwise achieving a clean result becomes difficult. Working with these kits can test the patience even of experienced builders, as assembly can turn into a constant fight with gaps, misalignment, and tricky joins. For beginners, this kind of experience can easily become disappointing, when expectations set by the box art don't match what actually happens during the build. I think this is a good place to wrap up the list. And that naturally leads to the question: if so many kits can be difficult for beginners, what models are actually good choices to start with? That's exactly what we'll cover in the next video, where we'll look at kits that make it easier to get into the hobby without unnecessary frustration.